Sarah?
Yes, Alex?
Are we old?
Yes, Alex.
How can you tell?
Because we needed to recruit our barista to explain to us the life of the youngs. Welcome, Mattise. Welcome to Mistakes Were Made, a podcast about non-monogamy for messy people like us. I'm Sarah. I'm a queer, non-monogamous therapist, parent, and writer, experiencing what is probably my fifth, sixth, or maybe seventh midlife crisis.
And I'm her husband, Alex. I'm not having a midlife crisis because I'm very cool, and all the people who sell me coffee tell me so.
I'm telling you, midlife crises are cool now. I'm rebranding them as cool. Get on board.
All right. I'm going to get a sports car then.
Start tallying them up. See how many you can acquire.
How many sports cars?
Yeah, sports cars, midnight crises, they go hand in hand.
I'm Jessica here producing. I feel like I'm on my third midlife crisis, so I'm really glad that they're cool now because I'm gonna start racking them up.
Yeah.
Right. And part of my argument for midlife crises is once you are out of midlife crisis territory, then you're like fully into counting down to death territory. As long as you stay in midlife, you still have that much more to live again, right? So I'm cheating death, basically. And today we have a very special guest, Mattise Wood, who is a queer, polyflexible barista in school to be a drama therapist, and who is currently on a softball team.
Most importantly. Thank you.
Are you thinking about going pro in softball, or is it more of a...
Who knows? Maybe that'll be my first midlife crisis. When does it start becoming a midlife crisis?
It's a really great question.
Yeah, if the world's going to end in 25 years, then it could be now.
It's now.
Yeah.
I'm halfway through.
Get a jump on that.
I know. And I am. I'm reclaiming athleticism. I'm becoming a drama therapist. I've always had that in my books. Now I'm like, what else can I add? Maybe softball. Maybe basketball. Who knows?
Ooh, I like that. Softball and basketball. We're actually, this is a little asterisk, but in our family right now, we're going through a little bit of an identity crisis as well around sports because we have kids that are entering that era of elementary school where all of like your social life is dictated by the sports you do, or in our case, do not do.
Yes.
And we're realizing that we don't have anyone in this family that knows dick about sports. Like, we are fucked.
And that was me. I was like the non-athletic child. And so therefore I did theater, which was super cool as like an 8-year-old.
So it started that early because I'm kind of like, when do we get into the AV club? When do we get into drama club? It
That's
feels like
definitely
none
our
of that
lane
starts
in our family.
Yeah, until middle school though.
Oh no, it's coming up.
Okay.
Get them into those clubs, get them into something, because I hate sports, truthfully, but there's
They're the worst.
They're the worst. And if you're not good at them, you feel so bad about yourself. But there is something about that community, and especially I've heard, super tangent, I'm so sorry, I've heard that kids don't do sleepovers anymore. Is that true?
I think that they are less common than they used to be. And partly this is anecdotal, but it feels to me like it has to do with the higher anxiety among kids these days. And that there's just a sense that it's like more challenging for them as a result.
I think that like that was my like group activity, was I just like was handed off to different parents to spend the night for different reasons. So I like didn't need sports. But if I hadn't had that, I would have probably done
It's like renting movies from Blockbuster was the sports of previous generation.
Yeah, exactly.
I've told this story before, but I remember at one point overhearing my parents talk about this because they were also not sports people. And my mom saying something like, it seems like all of her friends are getting into soccer. Should we like get her into soccer so that she can like sort of stay in step with her friends? And I remember sitting on the little steps listening to my parents in the kitchen, and my dad was like, have you seen her kick a ball? No, we are not paying for her to play soccer, which speaks to how much he completely misunderstood what it was about. He was like, the point was not that I was good at it.
Right.
But,
you weren't going to make the Olympic national team or whatever. Yeah.
Well, and that is that's something I'm working through, in my own therapy journey of like going to therapy, is like taking those childhood identities that I was put on of like, I was not athletic. My sister was athletic, so they put me in the creative route. And now I'm older and I'm like, I want to have any identity, which goes into anything. What umbrella term can I like capsulate myself in? So I'm like, I'm going to put myself in all of these different things to like reclaim that part of myself.
Can I just say that it's so lovely to hear the things that you're thinking about and talking about in therapy, because at 25, I was just doing more damage to myself, not like thinking about the damage that had already been done. I was just like banking more trauma,
entrenching that
like
childhood
binge
trauma,
drinking, and really digging in on it. So it's
going as deep
nice.
as you can, and now you're spending your time pulling yourself back out of that.
But it's a lot
hole.
more work. You gotta deeper hole to climb out of.
Yeah, well, maybe it's because I might only have 24. I'm in the midst of my midlife crisis that I had to dig that hole really deep for early on, and so now I'm working on digging it out just a little bit earlier than everyone else.
Yeah,
I like this. This is a good setup for what we wanted to talk about today, which was sort of generational perspectives on polyamory. We had this moment where we were looking back through our 3 seasons and many episodes, and realizing we had not had a single guest on who was in their 20s.
Wow. Oh, I didn't realize that. I'm the first one.
Yeah, you're a token young person.
Wow, I'm honored.
I hope you're not offended.
I'm getting to the point now. I'm like, I'm 25. I'm old, so I feel like
no. You have to speak for everyone between 29 and 0.
Deal.
That's your
your
role here. Yeah.
Take on all those voices.
You're up for that, right?
I think so.
And because especially through my practice, I feel like I've been exposed to, through working with lots of like queer poly folks, people in their 20s. That's like a big part of the group of people I work with. And I just was recognizing that there's a big distance culturally, I think, between the way a 44-year-old and maybe like many of our podcast listeners who are more likely to be in their 30s and 40s and coming from a like long background of monogamy and opening up, than folks in their 20s who have been dating non-monogamously or identified as polyamorous for most of their dating life. So thank you for being here. Talking to us about that.
You guys did the groundwork. I think that all is because as of recently, those non-traditional lifestyles are becoming more acceptable and more appreciated and less like sneered down at. So, you guys had to start the ball somewhere. So I couldn't be where I'm at without you guys doing that groundwork. So
I appreciate that. That's kind of on trend with what you were saying about how we had to do a bunch of damage to ourselves for longer so that people who were coming up behind us could do slightly less damage to themselves.
Yeah, hopefully that is the arc.
I really hope so.
It's true.
Of life. So does that mean that you feel like, because we've only been non-monogamous for 4 or 5 years.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you there. How long have you two been together?
We have been together for
150
yes.
You have aged beautifully.
Thank you.
Remember the women's suffrage fight? Sarah was great in that.
I believe it.
Killed it. I had mixed opinions, but she brought me around. No, we've been together since, we've been married for
since 2008.
14 years, and we were together for a few years before that. So a very long time.
Can I ask who approached the subject of wanting to, was it first opening up and then identifying as polyamorous, or how did that start?
Just really turned the tables.
Yeah, I like this.
I feel like we got to start.
Confidential.
This is also making me recognize that you're the first other therapist we've had on the show, so I may have met my match here. I'm like, you ask questions. I get it.
I think we talked about this on the podcast at least once, and there's sort of a lot of different, you can tell that story a lot of different ways. There's one version that is Sarah was learning about it in therapy school and then brought it up, but we certainly had things in our relationship where I had an attraction affair thing with another person prior to that, and so there was groundwork there.
If you will.
I like labeling that as groundwork.
Yeah,
exactly.
Groundwork. Yes, just laying the groundwork.
Trailblazer.
Exactly. Yes, the first mistakes. How do you talk about this? You were just answering these questions. This probably came up in that question for the article that you're going to be in.
Yeah, I was realizing that I'm being interviewed by someone who is 20 years older than me about polyamory for an upcoming interview. And I'm realizing that a lot of the vibes that I'm getting from them is sort of what I'm feeling towards you, where I'm oh, okay, this is what it's like when someone 20 years older than you is like, so you're just like living this like beautiful, queer, free, amazing, liberated life. And I'm like, yeah, totally. That's me. But he did ask about that. And I think the way I talk about it now is when I was in school to become a therapist, a lot of the people I was in that cohort with were non-monogamous. So I was exposed to it literally for the first time through my relationships with them.
So it wasn't the curriculum as much as it was the
people, the cohort, the community, and the curriculum. Yeah. There was like the
Bodhi in theory isn't just telling you to open up your relationship.
Exactly. And there was the summer
the Catholic school where you got your degree.
That's right. But there was the summer that I took human sexuality, and so it was like an intensive course, and we had a lot of people representing like kink communities and queer communities and non-monogamous communities like come in and talk. And so it was on my mind, and I was thinking about it a lot. And at one point, I remember looking up from my reading and saying to Alex, like, you know, this is like such an interesting case of these people who, similarly to us, they were like new parents, and had been monogamous for a long time. And I'm like, and they opened up their marriage, and like, here's an anecdote about it. And I remember it as Alex turning to me and going, I'd try that. And I was
I'm sure that's
I bet you would, Alex.
When I'm erased, like,
And then also the pandemic helped too, because we were very bored.
Yeah.
And trying to
isolated. And I think going through that was probably my first midlife crisis, like becoming a parent, switching careers, the pandemic. There was like a sense that all of the systems and identities that I had inhabited up until that point were on the table for review. You know?
Yeah.
And I was just like, okay, I don't know that I want to carry every single one of these into the next era of my life.
Yeah.
And monogamy was one of them that did not make the cut.
I mean, way to like look at what was on review and like not just like shove it to the side, but like actually spend some time doing that introspective work, which within a relationship that's already like pre-established is hard work. Like, but also maybe also easier because you had that sense of trust, like that foundation already laid.
Yeah, I think it was hard. Yes.
Yeah.
Maybe
the other
that's
thing
true.
you
Maybe
have
it was
to
easier
know
because of that. But
about us is that makes us sound like we were really thoughtful and we were really like careful in the way we proceeded. Alex and I think because of our background in journalism, are more like, okay, we've decided to do something, so let's just
do it.
Dive in and do it and see all the mistakes we
and
can
we kind
make.
of like dared each other into it, I think, in some ways. Like not literally, but you know, just
a little
kind of
bit.
being like, oh, well, I'm fine with it. And then you were like, well, I'm going to do it too then. And then we were like...
And Jessica was sitting here the whole time watching us like, guys. Pump the brakes.
But that meant we moved through it more quickly.
Yeah.
I guess. What about for you?
Well, I think that's what you just said of like diving into it. I feel like for me, almost along with my, like the coming to terms with my queerness, which shouldn't happen until the end of my college experience, which was 5 years ago, around the same time. So I guess maybe my first midlife crisis. Like it was more of like, how can I develop a sense of communication? It was with my like last partner. How can I like open up this realm of communication of thoughts I've already had, and rather than diving into it, just kind of like give space for like possibilities is really how I've always looked at it. And because I think that I dated a lot of men and like previously, like
big sigh.
I know.
that is such a recognizable sigh.
Like, oh God, I have to talk about this because, you know, coming to terms with my I knew since like I was like 6 that I had an attraction to like a big realm of people, all sorts of people. But I had conditioned myself to like date men, and I was good at it. I was a good girlfriend. I was like, I can handle this. This is fine. But there was always these thoughts in the back of my head. And I thought that part of life was just existing with those internal thoughts and not communicating them with your partner, and like not communicating them with your support system, and just kind of existing feeling like there's something wrong with you. And then I was really, really lucky to be in a house. I broke up with my like long-term boyfriend junior year of college, and then I existed in this house of like 7 beautiful people who were mostly queer. I think they have actually all started identifying as queer, and a mixture of them with like non-binary, non-cis people. And it was this space of like try it. Like, have fun. Like, do what you need. Let things come as they do. And that was a great intro into my queerness. And then I had a long-term partner over the past few years, and there was also, I was her first partner, and I knew what it was like to be in a long-term situation of feeling almost trapped. And I was like, I don't want you to ever feel trapped.
You were her first partner, like, period.
Period.
Like, okay.
I was her first partner ever. Like, I had never, like, she had never experienced that. And they, you know, I didn't want them to ever feel trapped. I wanted them to feel like they could continue to explore.
Right.
And so I broached the subject of, like, if you need some more experience, I have a shitload of experience. Like, I'm not lacking in that department, and I want you to feel like, so it was almost like protecting them from what I felt like I had experienced. Does that make sense?
Yeah, which is, like, really nice to, like, somebody not having that much dating experience being able to, I mean, one of the great things about, I think, about non-monogamy and polyamory is that you can meet new people without the sort of, like, not coming from a place of, like, loneliness or isolation, and without, like, this sense that you have to move into something that's really huge. It's just like everything is a little bit easier and more. It seems like it would be a really nice place to be.
Yeah.
Just like starting to date in general from. Yeah.
Starting to date in general and opening just like a, you know, dating, I mean, dating now with dating apps can be really scary. And really, I've had a bunch of bad experiences that I would have loved to like come home and tell someone about and to feel like they could unload. And I was like, if you're going to go be doing that, I'd love for you to be able to feel safe to come talk to me about it. And nothing really happened, but we just started that conversation with it. And that I think really helped facilitate just openness, which is always what I've loved about the concept of polyamory. And I feel like everyone in my circle exists with a lot of queer people. We've all read that book, Polysecure.
Of course.
Of course. How can you not? And it's all about doing that work of like figuring out your attachments. It's so much more self-work than it is of like engaging in the actual act of being polyamorous. And I just loved that. I loved that it was like, how can I be as authentic and honest both with myself and with my partner and partners as possible. And I loved that. I loved the umbrella of opportunity of openness and communication, which I think made it not easier to dive into, but more comfortable in a way, a little bit safer, which was nice.
And I hear in that something you were saying earlier, this idea that there's space to keep growing and changing individually and together, and that polyamory and I would say queerness are identities, practices, tools, depending on how you're looking at them in any given moment or in overlap, that encourage that. Yeah. Potentially.
And that was something that I talked about with my therapist recently of like, if I'm not engaging in polyamory actively, like I'm in a monogamous relationship right now, if I'm not engaging that, do I still have that identity? You know, and I've heard this with a lot of queer women who are dating cis straight men, that they struggle to know if they can like take on that identity. And it's this back and forth of like, can you take up that space? Can you hold that identity while not engaging in the practice? And that's a hard thing of like being respectful to those who are actively engaging and making sure that they feel like they have that space, while also still being like, no, I'm still who I am. Like I'm still me to my core. If that makes sense.
It does. And I think this goes back to the idea of change and fluidity. The idea that conscriptive monogamy and heteronormativity and just like sort of straight culture really presents relationships as a place that you arrive in and then stay kind of locked into for life. And I think bringing polyamory and queerness and non-traditional ways of living into our communities and our lives allows us to recognize that you can go through a season where you're practicing your relationships a certain way or where you're in a certain relationship constellation, and that season will change. It will absolutely change. And then here are some ways that you can navigate that change without traumatizing yourself and others, without like ruptures of trust and betrayal. Backing up a little bit and talking about the generational piece, I was curious to ask you if you feel like general impression that Gen Z and people in their 20s are more comfortable with polyamory and more likely to like move in and out of it or to date that way. Does that seem right? Are we like even, are we in the ballpark?
Well, it's funny that you, first, a quick anecdote about your therapy experience. Obviously, there's still the hesitation to share share identities with people, especially like I'm much more comfortable sharing that I'm queer than I'm sharing that I'm like polyamorous or polyflexible with people. But in my therapy classes that I'm experiencing, so many of my classmates are polyamorous and like they tell me, and then I'm like, oh, me too, and I get so excited. So it seems like that's still the same. That's, you know, what your experience and what I experienced. But a lot of my friend group, I exist with, you know, I've got a beautiful community here in Seattle, and most of my friends are queer, and there's still some people who give a little pushback, don't quite understand, I want to use that word, like why polyamory, like why I like it, why like the concept is intriguing and healthy for me. But with those few exceptions, most people have experienced it or have like weaved in and out of it, like you say, which make it, some people have very strong opinions about it.
Right.
And some people are like, oh yeah, then it's completely acceptable. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's like more utilized or more people identify as it in the Gen Z queer population, but I would say it's more discussed. Like it's definitely a topic of conversation.
Everybody has had some point of contact with it.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's not like you just made it up out of thin air. Like people our age sometimes treat it are just like, what?
Exactly.
Can you do that?
It's always like, oh yeah, like they have an anecdote to share. They're like, oh, well, in my previous or something. There's always some type of point of contact, like you said.
Where would you say the pushback comes from most often for folks in your generation?
I mean, right off the bat, and this word is so, I don't think nails it on the head, but jealousy of like people being like, oh, I couldn't do that. Like they're aware of it, they understand it, but it's like, oh, I couldn't do that because I would be too jealous, or I would have like some type of possessive feelings about it, which is always something that I kind of liked about polyamory, because I do think that, not that jealousy is good or that you should have that in relationships, but addressing those feelings, because I think jealousy happens even if you're not in in a polyamorous relationship. But having that umbrella term allows room for conversation in that relationship to be like, why am I feeling this way? Do I feel secure in this relationship? Like, am I so willing to go about it? And the people who are like, oh, I could never do that, that's not me, are usually because they're like, oh, I'm too jealous, or I feel insecure in those situations.
I often will tell people when they have that response, and I'm curious what the three of you think about this, is I'll say like, yeah, absolutely. I also am a jealous person, and I like polyamory because it's allowed me to like downgrade that particular emotion and just like integrate it into the spectrum of emotions. Instead of it being something that's like so terrifying and so bad, I have to do everything I possibly can to either hide it or avoid it. I'm just like, oh yeah, this is something that I experience in the same way that I experience like being depressed or being anxious or being lonely or being, you know, like there's a whole range, a beautiful rainbow of negative emotions that I experience on a daily basis. And this is one of them.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, and it's true that like jealousy can be, if you don't accept it in that way, then it can be sort of like a bottomless pit that even in a, you know, monogamous relationship, you can just like keep, you know, kind of following that to the point that you're like trying to absolutely control your partner and your relationship in a way that is untenable, right?
Yeah, I really want to ask this because I feel like it's such a powerful piece of how we talk about polyamory, and I don't know if it has a generational element to it yet, but I bet we'll find one. Why do you think people are so afraid of being jealous? Why is that like the worst thing? Why is that like the argument that you are most likely to get?
Well, speaking for the entire voice of my generation.
Right, from 0 to 29.
Exactly.
Remember?
So I have let me gather the data. I would say, you know, I think people are really scared of feeling insecure and getting that positive feedback of like, this is someone who I have, this is my possession, even though I feel like, you know, even if you've been dating for, you know, since 2008, you've been together, you have a family, like you never own someone, you don't have anyone. There's always that road in life. But but people don't want to feel like that's a possibility. They want to feel like what they have is secure. And when you address your jealousy, you're addressing that you feel that insecurity. And I've been doing a lot of work in therapy of when I feel like I'm not getting something from someone, whether it's a friend, whether it's my relationship, my therapist always tells me, like, how can you give that to yourself?
That's interesting.
You know, how can you find that security? How can you find that confidence within yourself? If you're feeling like you're not being told this, obviously communicate that with your partner, your friend. Of like, I would love some more words of affirmation. I'd love this. But ultimately, you know, you've got to figure out how to find that in your own being, how to affirm yourself, how to build yourself up despite that. And I think a lot of people look for that one person that will constantly be building them up and will always provide that security, so they don't have to look for it in themselves. That's what I think.
Yeah.
And you know, the million other people that I'm speaking for.
Right. So, the other thing that was coming up for me is maybe a little more political, but it's this recognition that we live in a culture that has these overlapping systems of ranking people by value all the time, and that there's this atmospheric anxiety that I think we're always navigating around, like, how safe are we in that kind of like ranking of people, whether that's about race or class or gender or size or, you know, the way you look, all of that. And we don't talk about that very often. We don't have a lot of language around expressing how that impacts us, and that there might be a kind of like condensing of some of that anxiety into our interpersonal dynamics.
Totally. Well, that brings me to a question for you two. Would you describe yourselves as anarcho relationships? What anarcho?
Relationship anarchists?
There we go.
Yeah,
Thank you.
That was our last episode, actually, that we recorded before this. And I think that, for me, like, digging into it more with somebody who, like, had more of a background and explaining what it actually means, not the kind of random things that we had projected on those titles, I would say yes, in terms of, like, that it doesn't mean just chaotically doing whatever the fuck you want in relationships, but it more means like thinking more creatively about every relationship that you have and like ascribing kind of value to them in a flatter way that doesn't just like prioritize like romantic or, you know, sexual or I guess like economically entangled relationships. Like all of those are different things that you can want to do with different people in different ways. And that's
deconstructing
like
the ranking.
Yeah. And that's like a lovely idea. And then also the sort of critique of capitalism piece that I think is built into that title. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes, too. It seems like that's a good sign when people say they identify with that, then that means that they're probably like questioning the way that those other systems work. Yeah. And influence the way that our personal relationships play out.
That gets me into a question about polyamory as an identity or a practice and why we are so inclined to associate it with having multiple sexual or romantic partners and if we need to. Like, how important is that? So to give a bit of context about the Relationship Anarchist podcast we just did.
I should have done my homework a little bit more.
Well, it didn't come out yet.
Oh, thank gosh. I was like, I feel like I did listen to your most recent episode. Okay, thank gosh. Okay.
Jessica, Alex, and I did an exercise called the Relationship Anarchy Smorgasbord, where you kind of identify what sectors of relationship you're in with people or would like to be in with people, or like what are you building together. And it was really interesting for the three of us. There were probably 24 sectors, something like that. I think we hit on 20 of those. The only ones we didn't hit on as like a throuple, if you wanted to call us that, right? Yeah. Were what we actually did with romantic, but no physical intimacy or sexual intimacy. So it was interesting to identify that in that way, we had been practicing a type of relationship anarchy and polyamory without the sexual intimacy piece across multiple partners. And that has just got me thinking a lot about polyamory as an identity, polyamory as a practice. Like, does it have to be sexual? Why does that feel so important? What are your thoughts?
Well, it goes back to when you asked me like what identifiers I would use at the beginning of the episode. And I was like, I don't want to like claim polyamorous if I'm not actively practicing. But I mean, that just deconstructs a little bit. because I do think it's, claiming it in all realms. So maybe edit that out. I'm not polyflexible. I'm polyamorous.
Find and replace.
Find and replace. Go ahead, Jessica. I think that I think of it immediately, my roommate that I've been living with for, 6 years, and we describe each other as platonic life partners. There's never been an ounce of sexual or romantic relationship there, but we economically, emotionally, spiritually, we support each other. And that relationship, is really important, even when I have my romantic relationships. And, sometimes people often think of us as a throuple as well, which is really interesting.
You and your
my partner, and then my roommate.
Yeah.
Which is so funny.
Right.
All of it, because we live in a 5-unit building, and almost everyone is like, "Oh, the throuple that lives downstairs."
Yeah.
And we have to be like, Sure.
Yes.
That is actually pretty accurate.
That's I'm like, yeah, she is always
That's probably
here.
better than just those 3 girlfriends.
Those 3 besties that live down there.
I feel like at this point, that bestie said in that tone more indicates that you're all sleeping with each other.
We're besties. Yeah. Wink, wink. And prioritizing those relationships at the same level as the romantic.
I want to ask a tangential follow-up question now, bringing those last 2 thoughts together. Do you feel jealousy in your life partner relationship in the same way that you do in your romantic girlfriend relationship?
Maybe not in the same way. Oh, but yeah, a little bit. She has I wasn't expecting to talk about her. She has a new boyfriend, and he's great. Love him. But I've noticed, me and my partner were talking about this last night, we don't spend as much time with her as usual. And throughout most of my time knowing her, she's been single, or not having a serious, relationship. And I have been experiencing a little bit of jealousy, but also I don't want to say contempt, because that's so vicious of a word, but a little bit of no one's gonna ever be good in my eyes. No one's ever gonna be good enough for her, even though he's great. But I'm also I'm doing this role better than you are, even though we're just truly besties. And so there is that. It's not jealousy in the same way, because jealousy that I experience, my current partner is so fucking cool. She's sick and so talented and so strong and so independent. And my jealousy that I experience there often comes from me feeling do I step up? Am I enough to which goes back to this heteronorm, or not heteronorm, but this monogamous structure of I'm not going to fill every role in her life. And I know that. And that's okay. But that jealousy is where I'm oh God, am I cool enough for her? Am I matching up? But with my roommate, it's more of is this person enough for her? I think she deserves more. I can do better there. So it's 2 different sides of of the same coin in a way, which is really interesting to think about. And I'm sure I'll have a fun therapy session after this podcast that I'll go into.
Glad we could help with that.
Thank you.
Also taking notes for a therapy session tomorrow. Well, and that monogamous as norm kind of state of mind is that there is one relationship that you ultimately find that becomes everything, and all other relationships are downgraded from there.
Yeah.
And I'm going to say something that other people might disagree with, but I think that if you are actively practicing a relationship style where you are not doing that, or you're trying to dismantle that and build a different type of community, then I do think you can call that polyamory, whether or not you have multiple sexual partners at any given time. What do you all think about that?
Yeah, and if you don't plan to, or you hold in yourself that you're not going to accept the that you're not going to find some person who is going to replace all of those relationships, Sarah's saying, that's a sort of positive ongoing stance to be taking that is different than just I'm dating around right now, or whatever the most casual version of polyamory is.
Yeah. Do you guys feel after your, half a decade run now of polyamory, how does that feel?
Ooh,
I'm going to age you. I'm going to age you a little bit.
Everything about this is making me feel old, and that is another thing.
Right.
Do you feel your interactions with jealousy between the 3 of you, between the 2 of you, with your other experiences, do you feel jealousy has changed, or maybe it's lessened, or it's just how you've interacted with it has been different?
You go first.
Yeah, I'll go first. I would say jealousy is something that I have always struggled with in all of my relationships and other sectors of my life. I would just say like it's just a struggle that I have. And that is, you know, all the attachment stuff that you've been alluding to that us therapists know so well and love to talk about. Am I enough? Am I too much? Am I safe? Yep. If I'm authentically myself with people, will they leave me? You know, all of that is just the work that I have to kind of like engage with, among other work, in this lifetime. And so I would definitely say it has changed in that sense of becoming less like something I have to hold as a secret. I feel like along with queerness, which I didn't, you know, I only like talked to people I was very close with about being queer until I was 40. And then we opened up.
Yeah.
And so that was a secret that I lived with. But I also think that the jealousy stuff was like a secret that I lived with, where I was like ashamed of how insecure I often felt. I worked really hard to have like a bold kind of brave identity in the world that was kind of counteracting, I think, some of the internal insecurity and jealousy that I often felt. So I think dismantling some of the shame around it and just recognizing it as part of who I am, the experiences that I had early on, how my nervous system works with attachment, connecting it to some of these larger political systems. For me, if you pull things out into the light and give it language, it just diffuses so much of its power really quickly.
Definitely.
And so I think that's been how it has changed for me the most. I mean, I'm totally open to it lessening. So I'll speak that into the universe. I would be fine with that. But in a way, like its potency has really, I think, diffused considerably for me.
That makes sense. Being able to like spread it out to show how many systems are impacting it rather than just it being this one singular emotion.
And this thing where I'm like, if I was just internally like more confident or like more something, I wouldn't feel this way. I think it's been really helpful to shift that story for myself.
Yeah. I guess, yeah. Oh, and I mean, I feel like a deeper, you were alluding to earlier, like a level of sort of like acceptance of that in yourself that I think might be a little bit generational. I think we sort of grew up in a culture that really told you that like you shouldn't have those feelings, or if you have them, you should hide them because that is like, and this might be a man thing too, but like that is like weakness and vulnerability, and like avoid those things. And I think that is sometimes when I experience jealousy or like get activated around it, like it's not the feeling itself, it's the feeling of like the feeling being seen. So I'm like working really hard to just like hide it, and I can feel my body being like, don't have a feeling, don't let anybody know that you're having a feeling, like deal with that later. Which is fucking intense, like, and especially when you put it up against the idea that like you would accept that and know that that was a thing that everybody experienced. But yeah, I feel like me and jealousy are like really having a moment right now, actually. And like prior to for like those 4, I don't think it is a linear progression necessarily from more of it to less of it, because like I had like 4 years of us being poly that I didn't really struggle with it all that much. And then like recently it has become much more of a thing for me, and like not just jealousy, but also just like vigilance and stuff like that. And I think that I'm not exactly sure where it came from, but you know, I don't think it's a coincidence that I sort of like lost one of my parents and kind of lost my other parent at the same time. And like, just like that can change
how vulnerable and stable you feel in the world in general.
Exactly.
Definitely.
So I don't know if it's just about like getting more free of it over time, but there could be ups and downs.
Circumstances change.
Yeah.
And then I think it's interesting that you both talked about, like, Sarah, you said like your nervous system having impact, and you talked about your body having a physical impact. And I think that we do try to push through those like I can imagine, especially like identifying as a man in this world, like having to feel like you can't show that physical impact. Like you can't show like all the nervous like movement you get when you're feeling the energy or like, and
or name it as you're experiencing it. It doesn't feel safe to do that.
Totally. Yeah. But your body, like the mind body problem of like, are they severed, but they're so clearly together, recognizing what am I physically feeling right now, and then putting that name to it. That's a hard thing to do.
Yeah. And there's like a deep level of denial about that too. Cause I think when I first started therapy, I had like like before we were open or anything like that, I had like a sort of somatic informed therapist who I just like bounced off of right away, because he would be like, how are you feeling in your body right now? And I was like, I feel terrible that you're asking me. And just was so like, didn't even recognize those reactions, like those physical reactions at all. I was just like, no, that doesn't happen to me. What are you talking about? But I think that wasn't because they weren't happening. It wasn't happening. It was because I was just like, had taught myself to not even
think about it.
Yeah, not even think about it. Yeah.
I do think there is a generational element to this. If part of what I'm hearing, and I would say I've observed as your partner, is maybe it's less you've like found these feelings and are engaging with them, and more that you've unearthed them, that they have actually always been there, but there's been like a lot of layers of protection on top of them. And I do think that's generational because it's very gendered as well. And for people growing up in our generation, Alex and I are 43 and 44, I feel like gender roles were so prescribed and so just like non-negotiable in a lot of ways, and that was just internalized at such a young age that it's hard to even see it, because it is like where your nervous system got built. And I know that's an experience people are still having, but it's worth saying that like a lot of language didn't exist around that when we were exploring our identities and feelings.
I feel like very envious of men who are, younger, even like in their 30s, of how like different their sort of like culture seems to be around that. And it's not to discount like the work that they've probably done to get there, but it does seem like the starting point was easy. Yeah,
not to diminish any of like the current like political forces that still attack non-traditional people, but it is a much safer world to like recognize those things in yourself, because obviously they're still embedded in our social system, so they're still happening, but the recognizing and then the dismantling and the is really starting to come up.
I almost wonder if there's like a polyamorous community building chosen family piece of this too, because if you're in a world where there's one person that you're allowed to share your feelings with, and maybe even there it's limited what realms, there is so much more of an inclination to just submerge them, because there is no place to express them. But if you're in a community where you have like intimate, emotional, reciprocal connection with multiple people, it does just feel safer, regardless of larger political climate, which, I feel like we could make the argument that it's better and that it's worse at the same time.
Yeah.
But if you have community where you can talk about these things and be held and not be risking all intimate connection in this one person, that it becomes safer as well.
Totally. Oh, I completely agree. And I think that was also something that's generational, of like, when you showed up in different ways for different relationships in your life, you were seen previously, at least from my understanding, you were seen as like two-faced or not authentically showing up in each relationship, because obviously you're acting different per person. But now I think that's so much more understood, of like multiple people hold different roles. Like I'm going to come towards like, for example, I love my mom to death, but she does not like her emotional intelligence is on the floor. Like she has no emotional intelligence. And like I've learned, like I love her. I can show up authentically in this relationship, but what I'm going to do to keep myself safe is I'm not going to bring my emotional baggage to her. I'm going to go, bring that to my chosen family, who are more adept at like holding that space for me. And that doesn't mean that I'm not authentically showing up in that relationship with my mom. I can just bring those things to a different person and feel like that community support.
It's more of a boundary than it is like a lie or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Or this idea of like containers that get built for relationships, and like what you're kind of co-creating together, whether or not you're doing it with someone who would feel comfortable with the term co-creating a relationship.
Yeah.
My mom too. Sounds very similar.
She's like, no, I'm not co-creating a relationship.
I'm like, you are.
I created you. So there is no co.
It's a one-way track. Exactly.
I have to go to the bathroom.
Okay.
Perfect.
Mattise, you were sharing that when you encounter people in your generation who are polyskeptical, they're most likely to say that they would be too jealous. I would say in our generation, when we encounter people who are polyskeptical, the things they're most likely to say are, what about the kids?
Right.
And who's going to like hold your hand while you die? Right? Like, wow. Right. That's like pretty much the two things that come up. They're just like, who's going to get old with you? Is it okay for the kids? And so I'm curious about like, whether that's a life stage thing or a generational thing, or just like, I thought I'd throw it out there.
Yeah. That's so that's so interesting to think of like who's going to be with you when you die, because I think that so much of these like non-traditional values that I hold so close to me are because I encountered death at such a young age. And I realized that like we said, like life is going to take you on, so like one day, things are going to be one way, and the next day something massive could happen, and now your life is on a completely different course. And my dad died super suddenly, and I watched my mom, who had been in like this 30-year-long relationship where she didn't have any friends. She had no support system outside of her husband. When he died so suddenly, like one night he was there, the next night he wasn't, I watched her for 5 years have no idea. She had no grapple on her identity. And I think that watching that, and I've seen some people who've encountered that same experience and they gravitate towards that support system. They want a single person because they feel like life is too short and they want that. But for me, I want as many support systems as possible. So that way, if I do lose one of them, I can still figure out who I am outside of that. And that's why polyamory, it's like polyamory, queerness, all of these like big umbrella terms feel like I have movement in my life. So that way, if something does come big and it does change something, I can move with it and I'm flexible with it.
So like both of those interpretations or responses are about trying to find safety, I guess. I mean,
it's all attachment style.
Yeah.
All attachment style. And I understand, I'm close with a queer person who lost a parent semi-recently, and we grew up in the same hometown, and their response to their loss was very much like, life is too short. I want to like go big. I want to go big with my love. And they commit really hard and they love really hard, and it's beautiful. And I love that for them, but it's just, not how I responded. And it's always interesting to see how people respond to those big catastrophic events in different ways.
It's interesting that you would say that there's a kind of romance to the idea of monogamy, in that sense that like, I'm going to love really big. I'm going to go all in on a person. Because one of the questions we had for you is there anything that is quaint or nostalgic or romantic about the monogamous like life we grew up with? Is there anything, as you think towards 40, 50 more years of having relationships, more than that, 60, oh my God, you are a lot younger than me. I can't even imagine. Is there anything that you're like, I don't know, there are pieces of what my parents had or pieces of what, say even Alex and I had for almost 20 years that do feel romantic or nostalgic, or does it all just seem like crap? All answers okay.
All answers okay. No, I definitely think that there's, and it's so hard to answer because I'm like, is this just a socialized part of me, right? But I do think, like, I look specifically at my sister's relationship, and she always says she knew who she was when she was 12 years old. And I'm like, I'm 25 and I have no idea who I am. I'm still figuring that out. And there's a comfort there. And I've thought this with religion. I've thought this with a lot of things. I think there is a comfort of being like set in your identity and being like set with a person and feeling like you don't have to look outside of that world because it's all right there for you. And my sister has a beautiful relationship with her husband, and they have worked through a lot. They've been together since they were 22. So they've been together for like close to 40 years, sorry, not going to age you like that. And I do think that that's gorgeous, but I also, and I love that for her. And I think that there is a safety for her and a life that she's built that I will never have. And I think that accompanies monogamy. And like a sense of, I just have like the devil's advocate singing in my ear the whole time I say this, because there's like having that commitment of like, this is my one person. And then in my ear, I'm hearing like the divorce rate's up to 60%. So I'm like, is that really, is that really a thing? But having that commitment, it has a beauty to it and has a socialized desire where I'm like, yeah, having a person to hold your hand while you're dying, sitting in that room is nice. But I also kind of hope that I have like a room full of people sitting in the room with me when I'm dying,
to feel chosen. And I think, we were talking about attachment styles. feeling chosen is something that I crave, and I know a lot of people do, and I don't actually want to pathologize that for folks. I just wonder if there's a way that we can feel chosen in a multidimensional way, right? You can choose and be chosen many times over, and it can be like an additive, not a subtractive process.
Well, yeah, and I think part of that like divorce rate is people who no longer feel chosen in those monogamous relationships, right? Like it's like when it happens when you're 22, then I guess it's the best monogamous long-term relationships. It feels like it's happening every day again, or some Hallmark card kind of thing. But practically speaking, it maybe doesn't. You know?
And you two, like, I think that's such, like, you guys are the antidote to that question of, like, you guys are still choosing each other over and over again, despite still living in that this polyamorous world where maybe that thought of being, like, chosen by one person isn't there. And I think that is, like, you are being chosen over and over by each other as well as others. But, like, there's still that commitment there, which is like an antidote to that feeling of not feeling chosen.
And there's like the time element, which I do think is generational. And we've talked about this here recently. The people who you've chosen and have chosen you over the course of many years and decades through the kinds of losses that you've been describing, through the sorts of like personal changes, through the big collective upheavals, that's just an element that does not get replaced immediately. And it doesn't mean you can't find that again, but I think there is also this sense that I think monogamy and some of the traditional like nuclear family structures make that actually seem very fragile, right? So I was thinking about when you were describing this person you recently went on a date with, and now, of course, I'm imagining them as this like really free-spirited, beautifully curly-haired person who looks amazing in a swimsuit and doesn't care about how their hair looks when they come out of the water. And I'm like, well, obviously you're going to want to go probably have some huge relationship with that person because, oh my God. And you may, and that would be great and wonderful. But then I was also thinking about like, but this is a person you're just getting to know. And it's like, there's nothing that replaces like many years of knowing someone and what that can look like.
Yeah.
And so it's just interesting to reflect on how the nuclear family and monogamy presents itself as actually pretty fragile in that respect, that you are being chosen by one person, but that could be threatened at any turn.
Yeah. And what happens when that implodes? Like, is there going to be some detrimental downfall rather than just like working through it?
Right. Yeah. Are you going to just like lose your entire life?
Yeah. As a result.
Okay. So I have a question. So if you guys were to like start over, let's say you hadn't had this like long relationship where you've navigated, but you just met now, you were just 20 and you just find each other. Would you, knowing what you know now and knowing in this generation, would you guys choose to start polyamorous, or do you think building that structure as monogamous and then becoming polyamorous?
That's a really good question.
I
mean, we did kind of fuck around for a little bit on the front end of our relationship. Like, we didn't just go straight into like being monogamous. Like, we kind of like were together a little bit and like, you know,
had other relationships.
We kind of had an open relationship for the first couple of years, not in name, but in
practice.
In practice. And I was very sort of determined to get there, you know, like
To become monogamous?
Yeah, to like get there with Sarah, I guess. And so like, you know, there was like I went to college and you went somewhere else and you were like, I'm never coming back again. And I was like, okay. And then I got a girlfriend in college. And then you were like, actually, I am coming back. And I was just immediately like, we're breaking up.
Done.
That was it.
Not very polyamorous.
Curly haired free spirit. I want her back.
Sorry, Amanda. And that was rude. But so I guess it's not really answering your question as to what we would do now. But I think, you know, I mean, that's what's like hard about it is like, are you like comfortable with being a little bit insecure, for the sort of greater good of your longer term relationship? Like a relationship that starts more open and without that security is probably a stronger one in the long term. Like if it lasts.
This is a really great question, and I haven't thought about it in exactly these terms before. And I think for me, if I had if I also had the self-knowledge, I think that's what would be crucial for me. I didn't go to therapy until Malcolm was born, right? In any significant way. And so that was at 35. And I think like prior to that experience of being committed to therapy and becoming a therapist, I would have been a mess in an open relationship. I think I was kind of a mess in a closed relationship for what it's worth. But I think I really needed that. And if I had that, if I like had the language for attachment, if I had the language for like exploring queerness, if I knew myself in those ways, I think I would be up for starting a really committed lifelong partnership with someone and being non-monogamous, and probably like that ebbing and flowing, especially around the experience of having children, which like really is disruptive.
Or like still making decisions that are kind of like more on that path, like deciding to have children or like deciding to like buy a house or move in together, like all things that we actually kind of did in community anyway. But to mitigate it, I think there's like a small petty voice like from in response to that question that is like, don't do that because you will never get the thing. Right? Like that's kind of like the counter argument, which I don't want to be like endorsing, but like that is what sort of there is like, well, if you just allow, your partners to have other partners, then they will choose one of those other partners over you.
I think that is the fear. The petty voice in me is like, when it gets hard, they'll bail.
Yeah. Or
and
some other person will come along and say, I want to be monogamous with you to your other partners and offer to give them everything, and that will be too tempting and they'll leave you behind.
No, totally.
It is a fear of abandonment. Like that's my whole ass bag over
I think
here.
that's
Always.
everybody's bag.
It's pretty much everybody's.
Yeah.
In some way, shape, or form, it just manifests differently.
Totally.
And I think that's what I would hope for all of us and all the generations to come. Like whatever your relationship structure or style is that we build relationships and multidimensional communities that make us feel like we will never be abandoned, and
become unabandonable.
Become unabandonable. Because I think that's the voice, right? Is always just like, if someone doesn't have to stay with you, will they stay with you when you have postpartum depression? If someone doesn't have to stay with you, will they stay with you while you like nurse their parents dying for 10 years? Like, or will it just get too hard and will like a newer model be too appealing? The
novelty is always scary, like that newness,
and like just weathering all of the complex experiences of life together. And I mean, that applies to our relationship too, Jessica. Believe you me, I am sometimes also worried that you will just want to bail on it because it just gets too gnarly, because it gets fucking gnarly. So yeah, just like that fear of what keeps people with you when the going gets rough and you don't know if it'll get less rough again anytime soon.
Yeah, I think you guys answered that beautifully. I was saying during the break, Sarah, I didn't have time to share this with you, just like watching you two communicate watching the three of you guys like do this podcast, and like your communication style is so beautiful, and it's so built with like the established structure of love, which I think is just like what allows the unfolding of like during who will weather the storm with you. My favorite teacher, I love her. She's like the foundation of the drama department at Antioch. Bobby, love you. Always says like, who will weather the storm with me and who will dance in the kitchen with me? And like, that's her like looking for those two sides. And it's so clear that you guys just do that all together. Which, as soon as I asked that question of like, would you go back and change it? It's like, it's the history that like allows the time that you keep talking that proves that over and over again. So as soon as I asked that question, I was like, oh, it's almost hard to even go back and be like, would I change that? Because it's like how you got now,
right?
Right.
And who knows if like a different journey would have allowed that to show up now.
I am very curious from a generational perspective for the people who come after you too, Mattise. Will it be possible that people will be able to live lives where they feel unabandonable? Like, can we do that? Is it possible? Are we working towards that? Are the things that we're talking about pointing us in that direction?
I don't know, because we're such social beings. We're created, our neurons co-mirror. So I do think that there's this like yearning for attachment, for that security. And when that security is threatened, you know, there's always going to be dysfunctional families. And there's always going to be that threatening of security. So the only thing I think that could make us feel unabandonable is less like how our relationships show up for each other and just how you show up for yourself. And teaching kids, I'm always impressed with my nieces, you know, they're 9 and 7, and their ability to look introspectively and like acknowledge their emotions and express what they need is already so much more advanced than I was at that age. And I do think that it's getting better with each generation of like giving children the language, giving children the recognizing, you know, to be able to recognize those things. And my nieces, although they live in Austin, Texas, you know, they fluctuate. My youngest niece goes back and forth of if she wants a girlfriend, does she want a boyfriend? And like, that's very comfortable for her to talk about. And like, I obviously didn't feel comfortable talking about that, even though it wasn't like vocalized as like homophobia existing in my household, but it just wasn't something that you
was represented.
Yeah.
So that's like making me come back to one of the first things you said about feeling more comfortable being like out as queer than out as polyamorous. And it is interesting that, yeah, with children, like there's certainly like, the acceptance of like gender fluidity is like extremely prevalent in their like schools that they're in, and the acceptance of like queerness or like homosexuality is like definitely like available to them. And I wonder like where and how like polyamory starts to show up.
When does it start to sink in?
And like, do they get messaging like, well, that's your boyfriend, you only have the one, you know, or like, yeah, when does it sneak in?
I mean, we talk to our kids about it. It's interesting because our kids are in community with kids whose parents are also poly.
Right.
But they don't necessarily go to the same schools.
And they don't always know as much as our kids know, I think.
Our kids know more.
I'm so sorry to interrupt.
No, please.
So your kids are like, obviously, I would feel like from you guys are such open, like honest people. Your kids know about your lifestyle and like do they ever ask questions?
They do, and they like vibe things too. I'd say there's a spectrum of like poly parents that we know, that some of them are like don't really talk to their kids about it at all. Not that they necessarily avoid it like really hard, but are just kind of like they're not interested in that. That's not like for them. And then there's kind of like us in the middle, and then there are other people. We are like very forthcoming with the information, but a little bit less forthcoming with the like interaction with other partners. Like we certainly do that to some extent, but then I know other people who are just like, they're, you know, the sort of like metamor in the couple is like there all the time and like spending one-on-one time with the kids and stuff like that.
I think for me, some of the hesitation there is about attachment. That I want my kids' attachment figures to be people that I feel will continue to be in their lives. And I'm not sure that I know how to navigate like a breakup. And for those people to continue to be like safe, steady attachment figures. And I'm just like so sensitive to that idea. So a little bit, I think I know people who like their other partners go on family vacations together and all of this stuff. And I'm just like, I love that. And also I'm just like a little worried for me that I could cultivate a sense of like safety around that for the kids, and that people wouldn't just disappear kind of without explanation. But it's worth thinking about. It's also interesting that the pennies keep dropping for our kids as they go through different developmental stages. So we've always talked about going on dates. We've always talked about people being like girlfriends or boyfriends or special friends and so on and so forth. But then it was like 6 months ago that I dropped you off somewhere, and one of our kids was like, "Where's he going?" And I'm like, "Oh, he's going on a date. He's going on like an overnight." And he was just sitting in the back, and he goes, wait. Have you kissed people other than Dad? And I was like, yeah, but we had talked about it, but you could just tell because he wasn't at the developmental phase where he kind of understood physical intimacy as aligning with like boyfriend, girlfriend monikers. And then he like got it.
Yeah. And I think there's a sense of like extending this, like keeping them having the feeling of safety. And this is like a very, whatever mononormative thought, I guess, but like, you want them to feel like their attachment figures are stable. And like, in theory, that should be able to happen with more than just like their mom and their dad.
And it is with their godparents and, TTs and stuff.
But yeah, that's the thing, that if you had people like coming in and going out a lot, you know, that could potentially, or a sense that like our relationship was like not stable. Like all of that should be okay, but it definitely is stuff that.
Well, I think I feel like just to give a little bit of pushback on like that feeling of like introducing new people who maybe aren't going to be there consistently. It's like that's understood as like messy, right? Of like, how do we navigate that? But really it's just almost like exposure therapy, because people are going to always go in and out of our lives.
That's very interesting.
And teaching them that from a young age. My nieces like got pretty, not, I wouldn't say attached, but they love my ex, and like me and my ex are on great terms. And my new partner, my sister, was going back and forth for a second of like, oh, well, like when we come to town, do I want to introduce my kids? And finally she said it. She was like, yeah, I do want to introduce the kids to your new partner. So that way my kids can learn like people come and people go, and how can they start to navigate the idea of like, oh, this person's just not around as much anymore.
Right.
And I think that it's very like the messiness nowadays, like people used to think like, how do we communicate queerness to kids? That felt too messy because it wasn't structured. It wasn't understood. It wasn't normal, quote unquote. But now it's a little bit more normal to like have those conversations. So kids are feeling comfortable with like being like, oh, maybe I'm going to have a girlfriend. Maybe I'm going to have a boyfriend. And anything in between. And now it's like introducing, okay, well, how do we teach that like people come and go and not have that like impact,
that not be abandonment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So this is like a post-abandonment universe, right?
Yeah.
That's very, very interesting.
And just like giving them, because people are always going to come and go, and it's often without our control. So it's how do we give kids the tools to like feel secure through that process?
Yeah.
Do they have enough of a web of community? This is what I keep coming back to, is like the individuals themselves know how to give themselves what they need, but also we are social creatures that are absolutely dependent on relationships. Do they have enough intimate, connected relationships that when people inevitably come and go, it doesn't feel devastating? You can feel loss, but it's not traumatic.
Yep.
And like that's always the distinction that I'm interested in, is like relationships end, people die, people move, we will lose people. What's the difference between that being grief and that being trauma?
100%. And I think people want to couple those two things of like, how do we avoid grief? And it's like, grief is unavoidable. We feel grief on all levels. Grief's always going to come and go. I felt, my coffee stand just got removed, and that I'm grieving that.
Yes.
I'm grieving.
As am I.
This setup.
One of your customers. I'm very upset about it.
And like that was, I had an attachment style, and I had an attachment to that coffee setup, and then it had to be moved for certain very specific reasons that were unavoidable, and I had to process that grief. Like that's always going to show up in your life. But how can we make sure it's not traumatic and that we have that web of support?
And really, when we think about our definitions of trauma, the one that comes to mind is the severing of relationship. So that's what is traumatic, is the idea that a relationship gets severed, and it's one you're incredibly emotionally or physically or dependent on in some way. Right? And so something ending versus something severing, and how many other relationships can you then lean on for support through that?
I also think that teaching kids the importance of like choosing while you're dating others, like, oh, I'm choosing not to continue this relationship, or I am choosing to continue this relationship, can help give them the power to know that they can make those choices themselves. There's a lot of people I know who, stick in abusive, harsh, monogamous relationships because they don't know the tools of, there's a lot of traumatic reasons in there, but the tools of support to get themselves out of that. And if you can teach kids that like, no, there's people that'll support you outside of that abusive relationship or that non-productive relationship for you, it can be really helpful. And then they can make those choices for themselves.
And building that resilience to be able to end relationships that you don't want to keep choosing for whatever reason, and that you can survive that as well.
Yeah.
Mattise, you're going to be such a good therapist.
I know. I'm so excited to have you as part of this profession. I already was trying to recruit Mattise to share an office space with me. And
oh my gosh,
therapist.
I want to so badly. The amount of kids that I see, you know, I've now been at this coffee shop for going on like 4 years. And so I've seen a good amount of parents who like no children, pregnant, and now the kids are turning like 2 years old, which is a wild production. I'm like, I want to therapize your child. I'm like, let me get in, let me be your therapist. I'll be there in like 5 years.
Is that what you're thinking of, like doing child therapy?
Yeah. So I want to do creative, like drama therapy, creative arts therapy, which, you know, obviously has a gear for children because their first language is play.
Yeah.
And how do we like work on that and teach them how to, you know, keep engaging that, but also teaching adults how to play again is something that's recently on my radar. And I'm really enjoying that of like, how do we get adults to like, you know, vibe with things other than their language. Really
that comes back to the softball and like, can we enjoy things that we're not good at?
Yep.
And like, can we navigate our own egos, which can get really rigid.
So hard. So hard. Yeah, no. And my partner, she's like an athlete, like very athletic, and has been an athlete like their whole life. And just like the encouragement of like knowing that even if I suck at something, like she's coming to my softball game tonight, and I was nervous. I was like, oh God, like I'm not great at it. Like what if I bunt every single pitch? But like knowing that she'll still love me even if I suck at it and still want to show up to my softball games, like that's affirmation in itself. Like that's security building of like, I can still do something different and I can play and show love outside of just like what I'm good at.
Are you going to be allowed to therapize our youngest? Because I feel like...
Yeah.
Please.
Totally.
Oh, the vibes. They would be so strong.
Yeah.
I would love that.
Noted.
I would love that.
Well, before we go, we didn't ask you the central question.
Oh, yeah.
About mistakes that you feel like you have made. We can narrow it down, not just entire life mistakes, but
I was like, we're going to be here for another 2 hours.
Polyamory or, you know, kind of decisions around monogamy, non-monogamy, the way those things have played out.
Yeah, I think that, you know, I always like struggle with like looking, it's so funny because I did ask you guys that question of like going back, would you do it? But it's hard because it's like I wouldn't change anything that I've done because I think it's got me where I'm at. But I think that the biggest mistakes are not verbalizing exactly how I feel, and trying to change, you know, fundamental parts of me in order to comply with the social standards that I think are normal. And being very like, just like not being honest I think that that's the thing that's always like so attracted me towards polyamory, is that it just creates a net of honesty and a container of honesty, and vulnerability. And there's been times where I tried to dismiss that and I tried to like keep going on a path that I thought was like the correct quote unquote
and just
path.
covering up parts of yourself.
Yeah. Whether it's jealousy, whatever it is. And if I can just like show up and be honest and like keep allowing room for conversation, you know, in relationships, whether it's like my PLP, my bestie, or if it's with my current partner, my past partner, partners all over the place. When I want to show up in the way that I think they want me to show up is always when I end up like resentment builds. And I think resentment is just a relationship killer. You know, resentment is something that sits unburdened for so long. And then when it shows up, it's like, whoa, like there's almost no unraveling it. And so just to like make sure that all the relationships I build are like, how can I be so forthcoming and so honest that there's no room for there's no room for resentment.
Right. And then maybe you find out that that person just doesn't have that thing for you, but at least you know before you invest a bunch into it.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, energy is valuable. Oh, what does my therapist always say? She always says that my love is infinite, but time is not.
Yes.
You know, time is valuable. And I like don't want to put my time into something or someone or multiple people that don't appreciate it and don't honor it.
Just to get some feeling of safety,
Yep.
I guess. Yeah.
Exactly. What about you? I'm going to flip that on you.
Oh, this whole podcast is us talking about mistakes.
I think actually I'm going to build on what you just said, Mattise. I think until pretty recently in non-monogamy, there has still been a lot of like, how can I make myself be the thing that people of interest, I perceive, want me to be.
That you're chosen with. Yeah.
Right. Like, how can I be the right kind of queer, the right kind of poly, the right kind of like poly parent, the right, you know, like there's just so many things there. I want to like show up the way I imagine people perceive me and want me to be. And I have found myself like pretty far down the road in relationships with people I really genuinely cared about. And I don't regret my time with them, but I can look back now and see, to your point, like where the turn happened. Yeah. And I was like, this relationship is not actually working for me the way it's going, but I'm just going to try and find a way to fit myself into it. Yeah. Whether that's like in time spent or intensity or like other relationships that, you know, there's like all kinds of things.
There's so many things that it could be.
And then I feel like when they did inevitably end, there was some of that resentment. There was more of an inclination that this is now going to be a relationship that severs instead of one that can continue on in some iteration. So I think that's a more recent lesson for me. I have felt more confident recently ending relationships or having relationships ended with me earlier on to avoid that. Yeah. And to be able to just like tolerate the fact that sometimes the arc of some relationships is pretty short, and that still was like a cool relationship. I'm glad
beneficial.
I had. Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah, I think for me, I've been thinking recently a lot about like vulnerability and like misunderstanding what that actually means and like misconstruing it to be like kind of like openness, but not having needs, and like not being, I mean, vulnerable. I don't know how I misunderstood that, but yeah, not I guess being in relationships in a way that I could really be like hurt by them, and that I asked for things in them, like kind of back to what you were talking about, and that you can't really, like, that's just a scary thing to do, because it's unsafe, but then you're never, if you're not doing that, then you're never really there in the first place. And I think that's like a thing that I've been understanding more lately.
Yeah, 100%. My first experience with, you know, really like accepting that identity of polyamory with my ex was really scary, because I thought that when I broke up with them, it meant that like this identity that I had claimed was somehow a lie. And like, I was like, rather than just recognizing that like them and I had been on the road to be friends for a while, and we're great friends, and I love that, but like recognizing that like that didn't mean like being vulnerable to that need, being vulnerable that like this relationship isn't fulfilling me in the way that like I previously had thought. It's not a failure, and that arc is beautiful. And that I can be vulnerable to be like, this need is not being fulfilled, and therefore being able to transition into something else. And now we have a great friendship that's like gorgeous, and I'm so grateful for. And I think that that's a hard lesson to learn, and probably a lesson that'll be learned over and over and over again.
Yeah, in a way, the longer I think about, and we talk about mistakes on this podcast, the more I recognize that I am really just grappling with the same ones in different iterations. And that, again, is just like kind of the work of attachment and connection for me. And that's okay.
Yeah. Gosh, we're all just finding our attachment within ourselves. Like, how do I just keep existing with this person, myself, over and over again?
Yeah.
Hard thing.
It is. Also, it's pretty cool.
I know, it's so fun, isn't it? I am getting to the point in therapy where now I'm just like excited I'm like, what else you got in store for me? What else can I figure out? Yeah. Which is an exciting place to be.
Yeah. I love that. Okay.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Mattise. And thank you for listening to Mistakes Were Made. You can find us on Instagram at mistakescast, and you can also email us at mistakescast@gmail.com. I don't think we have any announcements to make right now, but we'll be back with another episode in 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah. Thanks so much, y'all. This was such a good conversation. Thank you.